net carbon zero emissions. So let's get started with Katie Dillon, Dave Homans, and with Tim Freno.
All right, good morning, folks. Thanks for being here. Always nice to see friendly faces in the audience, and I know a lot of you have been along with us on this journey at different times, so glad to have you here today. And just as a note, we are going to hold questions to the end because we have a lot of content to get through, but then we also want to leave a lot of time at the end for discussion, and it's going to be really valuable for us to hear from you all about your thoughts and how we kind of move forward. So we're going to be talking today about our church's journey to net zero, and we're going to be going over some of our history and then where we are at today. So just as a little background, the work here at Plymouth Church, starting to focus on creation care and environmental issues, started almost 20 years ago. I believe it was 18 years ago, according to Tim, because I think he was there, one of the original members of this group, had a showing of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth documentary. And that group really felt called to then focus on how can we as a church be part of the solution. And so at that time, a working group was formed called the Caring for Creation Working Group. And in fact, when I first came to Plymouth, I started getting involved in the Caring for Creation Working Group. That's kind of what drew me in. It's a big passion of mine. And a lot of folks here in this room have been part of that group from time to time. A few years ago, the group changed their name to Climate and Environmental Justice to kind of reflect, there's a lot of work focused around justice here at Plymouth Congregational. And of course, we know that justice is very intersectional. So we have, racial justice, environmental justice, and it intersects with other types of justice as well, housing justice. We know all of these issues are intertwined. So the group also in 2008 came up with our statement on environmental sustainability that was in fact adopted at a congregational meeting. And this statement is really focused on how we kind of have a vision of where we want to be and who we want to be in the world. We are called to serve as stewards of the earth, to protect and nurture the environment, and to engage in sustainable practices that meet the needs of the present without compromising the lives of future generations. And a lot of times we talk about the ways that we as a community do the work that we do, framed in the purposes of the church. And of course, our work really touches on all three buckets: the within, so that's our personal work, among, so our work together, and then beyond, the way that we live out in the world.
Good morning. I'm Dave Homans, and I have the enviable job of making you feel a little uncomfortable for the next 5 minutes, so just be prepared. We'll try to end on an upbeat note. For those of you who actually don't accept the science, I would like to have an appointment with you at the end. We're not going to talk about that now, but the science is unequivocal. We're heating up the planet at an unprecedented rate, and it's due primarily to the burning of fossil fuels. I'd also like to point out that later is too late. We can't kick this can down the road and expect our children to solve it. It's already here. At my age, I tend to forget things, but if I go back to last fall, we canceled the Twin Cities Marathon because of heat. The Bear Grease sled dog race did not happen this year because there was no snow. The Loppet got interrupted, I don't know how many times, I don't know how many different ways, because there was no snow. So we had the warmest winter on record, and that's probably due to the fact that our oceans are at an unprecedentedly high temperature. So it's here. And it's really up to us to solve this problem. And fortunately, we actually do have the technology. Now, this may be a little hard to see in the back, but there is a very significant moral imperative here. The upper left-hand graph here is who creates the problem. That's carbon dioxide emissions per capita. And the darker the color, the higher the CO2 emissions per capita. And if you look, it's the United States, Russia, Europe, somewhat China, and Australia. We're creating the problem. If you look at the equatorial regions in South Asia, they're not so much creating the problem. I'm going to particularly point to South Vietnam. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But they're not really creating the problem. But boy, will they suffer. And that's the problem. The people who are suffering from this, and you may or may not be able to read it, but the number of ways in which they are suffering is legion. You know, there are floods, there are hurricanes, there are typhoons. There's desertification of farmland, crop failure just due to heat. There's an incredible spread of infectious diseases that are appearing in places where they shouldn't because of the climate change. It goes on and on and on. There was a really, to me, powerful piece published in the New York Times a few years ago looking at exactly what would be underwater by the year 2050. And the rising seas are going to displace probably 150 million people. I mean, we think we have an immigration problem right now in the United States. Think of 150 people having to move because of rising seas. An area that is personally important to me is the southern part of Vietnam. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with another group of medical professionals in the city of Can Tha, Vietnam. It was a cardiology hospital. I got to know some of the people there, learned a lot. Can Tha, on this map, is right here. Everything in blue on that map will be underwater by the year of 2050. So the entire city of 1.2 million people, including that hospital, will be underwater by 2050. And then I have to just observe that we're very deliberate, if you go to our website, about acknowledging that we're sitting here on land that used to belong to the Lakota people. And we acknowledge some responsibility for the fact that we're occupying that land right now. What is our message to the people of South Vietnam? Because right now we're depriving them of their historical lands through our carbon emissions. So that feels to me like there's a real moral issue going on here. And we don't have to go to South Vietnam. We can just look right here in the Twin Cities. Our building here, despite all the work you're going to hear about that we have done to reduce our carbon emissions, right now, every year, we're pumping about 400 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, right here in Minneapolis. And if you go down and you look at the public health documents, and we can now analyze, we've got a couple of docs here, we can analyze various disease rates by zip code. And a good one to look at are asthma emergency department admissions. So this is the per capita rate at which kids, predominantly kids, but also adults, are ending up in the emergency department with asthma attacks. And there's a graph there of Hennepin County, and again, the darker the color, the higher the incidence of asthma episodes that wind up in the ER. And it concentrates in the central city. So our carbon emissions here and our pollution emissions here are affecting the health of the people in our city, and it's not affecting all socioeconomic groups equally. It's really affecting those with fewer resources. So they're more affected, and they have fewer resources to deal with the issue. So we have our own inconvenient truth, in addition to Al Gore's. Our beautiful building here is actually harming people. Now, we talk about reparations sometimes, and that concept has been applied to the climate, because we've got rich countries and rich people producing the problem, and people with fewer resources experiencing the problem. And it gets into a kind of a tricky debate, which we're not going to talk about now, but you can calculate a price on carbon. And the methodology actually has improved, and the price, I hate to tell you, is going up. So if you really go back to the Obama administration, they were talking about $43 per ton of CO2. It's now up to about $200 per ton that we release. Actually, Meredith and I invest in an organization called Climeworks. They've got this plant in Iceland where they use geothermal energy to power a sequestration of CO2, and then they put it way down underground. Hopefully it will stay there. And we have to pay them $200, just a little bit over $200 per ton of CO2 that they take out of the atmosphere. So that's about the going rate. And if Plymouth Church were to assume the true cost of our current CO2 emissions, 400 tons times about $190 per pound or per ton is $76,000 per year that we're not paying right now. But that would be the cost if we had to pay for the damage that our CO2 emissions cause. So again, that creates, at least in some of our minds, a true imperative. So now I'll leave you with at least a nice quote that is a little more inspiring. It comes from Project Drawdown. You may be familiar with that. We take 100% responsibility, and we stop blaming others. We see global warming not as an inevitability, but as an invitation to build, to innovate, to affect change, a pathway that awakens creativity, compassion, and genius. It's not a liberal agenda. It's not a conservative agenda. It's a human one. And with that, Tim takes you through our journey of how we've come so far.
Well, I'm Tim Freeman, and I actually get the fun part of this, explaining what we have done over the last 10 years, but I'm also going to cover some of the things we might want to consider doing. So, the good news is we've done quite a bit. Over the last 10 years, we've reduced our carbon footprint by about 50%. We've gone from about 800 tons per year down to, as Dave said, 400 tons this last year. Of course, it was a warm year, so okay. So how did we accomplish what we've done so far? One of the key steps is reducing waste. Just simple things like turning off the lights, turning down the thermostat, sealing air leaks, adding insulation to the attic, getting better light bulbs. For example, in the parking lot, we replaced them with LED fixtures, and that has been saving the church $2,000 per year. They paid for themselves in 5 years, and now we're getting that extra funds. It's kind of cool. Back in 2017, thanks to the donations from many of you, we installed 20 kilowatts of solar on the roof of the education wing. That currently saves Plymouth $4,000 a year. So that's really cool. There's a picture, an aerial view. There's the education wing. You notice a theater right next to there? The following year, 2018, we had hoped to add more solar, but the roof wasn't good enough. So we couldn't do that. So what we did instead, we went with community solar, where the solar is located somewhere else. This is Ramp A down by Target Center. And we have a 50 kilowatt subscription to that. That saves us about $7,000 a year off of our electric bill. We actually bought those shares, so we don't pay so much per year. Okay. But here's the big one, wind source. This is probably the easiest thing we could do, and it's making the biggest difference. In fact, right now, about 70% of the electricity for this building comes from wind. Okay. Now, if you combine the rooftop solar, the Ramp A community solar garden, and wind, we now have about 90% of our electricity is coming from carbon-free sources. Okay. Now, our congregation has been very supportive of these efforts, and it's involved work by many members over many years. But I'd like to call out a couple people in particular, Jan and Rick Neville. They were so adept at getting these things approved. And so most of our progress was made a few years ago. We're kind of reboot this right now. Okay, we got that going. So now, what do we need to do? Now, how much do you know about how we heat our building? Does anyone know how we do it? I'll give you a few things here. Originally, we used coal. I imagine someone is down there shoveling. There's actually a slanted floor that the coal slides down. It's still down there, okay? Then after coal, what do we think we went to? Oil. In fact, the old oil tank is still in the basement. They got it blocked off with concrete blocks. So if you're ever down by the janitor's closet, their office down there, just check it out. But now, of course, we use natural gas. It heats water. These are boilers. They heat water up. There's 2 boiler rooms at Plymouth. One with these 5 boilers is in the basement just west of the landmark room, just on the other side of the wall. Okay. All 5 boilers are over 30 years old. which is longer than most boilers last. So we're living on borrowed time here. There are also 3 almost identical boilers in the education wing, and at best, all 8 of the boilers are only 80% efficient. Now compare that to 95 to 98 now, so let's definitely get good ones next time, okay? Got that going on. The boilers heat water, which passes through radiators and through baseboards, and also they pass through our air handling system where they warm the air that heats rooms like the sanctuary, guild hall, and even this room. So we got that going on. In addition to the 8 boilers, we have 10 rooftop units, which bring fresh air into the building, and some of them use natural gas to preheat that air. So we have a lot of natural gas going on there, okay? Now, it's not just boilers that need replaced. Look at those steam pipes. When Plymouth switched from steam heat to hot water heat, we kept the same pipes. It was very common back then. The problem is when you go to water heat, your return pipes should be twice the size. Ours are not. They're very inefficient. Now, if you've ever been under this floor in the youth room, you can see the steam pipes are still down there, okay? I assume that's a big one, but then you got the return water one, so I don't really know what's what down there. I know it's a warm room. We took a tour last year. Okay. Now, just a couple more slides that I have. Fortunately, there's other ways to heat our building. 2 years ago, thanks to Katie, several of us took a tour of Mount Olive Lutheran over in Chicago and 38th in Minneapolis. They have gone what they call geothermal. It's actually ground source heat pumps. It turns out that the ground beneath our feet has the ability to hold a huge amount of heat. If you dig down about 10 feet, the temperature is almost constant at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the winter. So they buried 4.5 miles of tubing in the ground in their parking lot, that right there. And the way they did it, they dug 48 wells. Each well was 8 inches in diameter and 250 feet deep. Okay? We got that going on. Next slide, my last slide. Now here's a little bit about how it works. It shows 5 wells on the left there. They put a loop of tubing in each well, and they pass a antifreeze solution through it. And they circulate that antifreeze back through the heat pump in the church, and they extract the heat. So that's pretty much it. That's the gold standard of what you can do, but it's not cheap. We got that going on. So how should Plymouth go about upgrading our heating system? And how should projects like this fit in with everything else the church is doing, like fixing the roof? There's rooftop units up there. We got to coordinate all this stuff. So it requires experts and so forth. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave and Katie to explore what we could do now. Yeah.
So the good news is the depressing stuff, I said, we're past that. Hopefully we made a case that we really ought to be doing this. But and we actually have come quite a distance, and we have the technology. We really know, in large part, how to solve this problem, if there's a will. And we're going to sort of channel the Neville's ability to get things done. We actually want to now proceed to, galvanize that will and actually do this. We're going to ask you to put your thinking caps on, because what we need you to do is tell us what we're missing and we're getting wrong. So I'm going to give you a high-level view of the way we have approached it and the way we're approaching it, but don't mistake me for someone who knows actually what we're doing or, the best way to get it done. So that's where you come in, is to say, have you thought about? So the first thing we did is we wanted to talk to leadership, and we've talked to the clergy in particular, and they're supportive. They really think this is a moral imperative. This is an important thing to do. We've also talked with the deacons and church council, and church council has issued a very supportive statement as well. So we think we've touched base with the church leadership. Then you always have to look at your internal stakeholders. And of course, everybody in the church is a stakeholder, but there are some particular committees that we really felt it was very important. We can't do this, obviously without talking to the facilities management committee, because they really know the facility better than we do. And so we've talked to them, and since this is going to take money, we've also talked to finance and administration. So we're trying to touch base with the key stakeholders, and if you think we're missing someone, that's what Q&A is for. We want to hear from you. We also are learning from other congregations. We've networked with Interfaith Power and Light. We've seen what some real leading, like Mount Alb, what they've done. They've taken the big step, and so we're trying to learn from them what went well, what didn't. And then there's a congregation, Mayflower. You'll hear more about their project. They're also a bit ahead of us on this. We'd like to be leaders in the community. We'd like to have people look at Plymouth and say, wow, can we copy some of the things they did? So we're learning from other congregations. And if you know of good congregations that we should touch base with, we'd like to hear from you. We are trying to learn more about our facility. We've almost studied it to death, not quite, but we've had a number of assessments in, a number of energy audits in. We've talked to Brian Wheeler, who's a great internal source. We've had some engineering firms come in and take a look at things and give us some verbal feedback on that. And again, we could always do more of that, but we are trying to get the engineering expertise that's in the community. We are now at the point of engaging a particular expert that Katie will tell you much more about. And really now this is the launching of the bigger piece, which is talking to the congregation in general. We've talked to a lot of stakeholders and committees and this and that, but this is really something the congregation is going to have to embrace and prioritize. And again, we've very much value your thoughts on what would be the most effective ways to communicate with the congregation, find out what they're feeling about it, where their priorities sit, how the whole church feels about it. And I think Katie's going to talk about Peter a little more.
Thanks. All right, so where do we go from here, right? We recognize that among our Climate and Environmental Justice Committee, we have some incredible folks and folks with a lot of knowledge, and we are also not necessarily the experts. So we started engaging last year with a member of Plymouth. His name is Peter Dahl, who is one of the experts. He has his own consultant agency called Define Sustainability, and they work with organizations on sustainability practices and moving towards net zero. We're incredibly lucky that because Peter is a member here at Plymouth, he was really excited about the work that we were doing and wanted to start to dive in along with us and give us some of his expertise, actually at no cost, just to help us understand where we could go from here. And so Peter, he was able to take a look at our energy usage over the last year-ish, so I think it was like October 2022 through October 2023, and analyze our emissions. And that's where the number that Dave was mentioning earlier, 400 metric tons of CO2 emissions, is basically like, as he analyzed all of our energy usage, that's the conclusion that he came to. And so, then at that point, then we were able to start discussions about, okay, if we know where we are, then where do we go from here? And I also want to mention that Peter has worked very, very closely with Mayflower Church. They engaged him as a consultant in their work on decarbonization. And a couple of things that Peter brings to this work. One, obviously he's a member here, so he has an investment and a care for the work that we're doing. But also in his work with Mayflower, he was able to see how they kind of were able to work on some of those internal conversations, what Dave was mentioning, some of the stakeholder conversations, and help us to understand how were they able to kind of bring this through their congregation and get a level of commitment from the congregation. So we really appreciate his expertise in that as well. And I'll say that what he has told us as well about Mayflower is that they actually want, what they've said and what they kind of their stake in the ground is that they want to be almost like on the forefront and that prophetic voice of what decarbonization of a faith community building could look like, and that they want to be the example out there. And so I think we sort of want to be like closely following them, right? Like we're like, oh, okay, you can be a little bit ahead of us, but like, let's be right there behind you. And so this is just an outline that Peter provided to us. It's really detailed, and I know it's going to be a little hard to see, but it outlines some of the major steps to decarbonization. And so on the far left, it's really where are we currently at right now. We kind of need to know where we are to know where we're going. And then the next steps of what he recommends is digging in deeper into our building envelope to understand where do we have some opportunities to increase efficiency, maybe through insulation or sealing things, so that we're not just losing heat out of the building, and then potentially also an HVAC study. I'm not an engineer. I don't know all of the details about things like this, but he was able to have a really wonderful conversation, in-depth conversation with some of our resident engineers on the Facilities Management Committee, and they got into the weeds on some of this. And I think really recognizing that there's a lot of knowledge that Peter can have as that committee works on a lot of HVAC stuff specifically. But really, so from here, Outreach and Outreach Board and the Climate and Environmental Justice Committee said, all right, in order to do these steps, we do really need a partner, and we need that expert partner. So we've recommended that we engage with Peter as a paid consultant to help us shepherd this work forward. And so that has all gone through the approval process, and we're finalizing that, but he's going to be a really great resource for us. I want to mention that the funding that we're using to pay Peter is out of the Plymouth Green Fund. If you're not familiar with the Plymouth Green Fund, this is a fund that was created by members of the congregation to specifically fund projects that will decarbonize, especially within our building usage, almost like an internal version of an offset program. We are always going to be continuing to take donations, so if you want to contribute to this work, do look up more information about the Green Fund. And then the last thing I'll just leave you all with before we dig into some questions and discussion is along kind of our journey as climate and environmental justice, we are also exploring becoming an initiative within the church. So we're working with Leadership Council about how to go through that process, and primarily because we've been working as a committee of the Outreach Board, which is great, and you know, all of this amazing work has been able to be moved forward. But at this point, especially with the work we want to do on decarbonization, we feel that engaging with other leaders of the congregation at that leadership level is going to be critical to make sure that we're sort of a touch point in a lot of different parts of the life of the church, because obviously it's more than just outreach. You know, we're talking about building, we're talking about you know, finance and admin and all of those pieces. So that's in the works, more to come, but we're hopeful. So really, we want to use the rest of our time certainly to answer questions from you all, what kind of comes up in this presentation, but also would love to get your feedback. How are you feeling about this? Does it feel like the right direction for the church to go? Do you feel like it aligns with our values and with our purposes? Are there things we're missing? Are there opportunities that we haven't seen yet? Are there conversations that we need to be having that we haven't yet mentioned? So I know there's microphones. Bryce is, I think, going to help to pass the mics, but we're all going to be here to answer the questions. They won't leave me alone to do that.
Thank you for this great presentation.
Thanks.
Really
yeah,
helpful.
Absolutely.
I am definitely on board, have been for a number of years, less active, but still with you.
A cheerleader. We love that. Yes, absolutely.
And so I sent in a donation initially to get the Green Fund started, but then
Awesome.
never
Thank you.
heard anything. So I would love to see a more virulent follow-up, follow-through on an annual basis.
Yeah.
And for those of us in this room, maybe not all of us, we have these big tax-deferred pools of funds that we can directly contribute tax-free. And I'm wondering if this fund would qualify for that.
That would definitely be a question above my pay grade. I think Seth might know more about that, Ann might know more about that, but I believe it would because it's a...
That's true, we can check. If you want to, we can talk.
Good.
I can get an answer directly for you. Send me an email so I remember.
Yeah, but because it does come in as a contribution within the church finances and the church can accept monies from those types of funds, I believe it wouldn't be an issue.
Sorry, is the question, is the green fund tax deductible? Is that the basic?
No.
Oh, no, okay. I misunderstood.
I know it's tax deductible,
Yeah.
but it needs a certain certification to qualify for these direct, whatever.
Just, yeah, it's like distributions from, yeah.
I'd like to add a little bit about what has been done with the Green Fund. Essentially nothing, it's just been growing. We had planned to have another solar garden in Watertown, which is about 40 miles west of the Twin Cities, and we kept on saying, it's being delayed, it's being delayed. It turns out there was a lawsuit. The township was trying to prevent them from building the solar garden. And so right now, we're saying, what the heck, let's use the money and get a study. So that's yeah.
But yeah, we-
Can I just say, that's really helpful to get that feedback.
Yeah.
And we commit to you, we're going to do better at following up. So thank you.
Well, I'd like to help.
Yeah, okay.
Awesome, thank you.
I grew up as a child attending Mayflower Church, and Plymouth was always the big dog and we were the tail. And I think it's just sort of delightful that Mayflower is maybe perhaps farther along this path than we are. And it's fantastic that maybe the tail is wagging the dog now a little bit, and just like we learn from our children, you know, as time goes by. But my question is, if Mayflower, just to pick them as the example that you brought up, is doing things that are a little further down the road, perhaps, than we are. Can we embed someone there? No, I'm serious.
Like a spy, or?
Well, a spy with their permission.
Sure.
You know, just to learn from what they're doing and bring their deliberations back. Or maybe are other examples other than Plymouth where we might do that. Learn from people who are doing the same thing, so everybody's not reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, great question. And I think we know that a goal in our mind is to connect with maybe who is the right person at Mayflower. The person that Peter had worked really close with, his name is Thor. He's actually left Mayflower and he's now over at Hennepin Methodist. So we did lose that connection, unfortunately. But I think that there's got to be some point people at Mayflower that would be really worth connecting with, and maybe having regular check-ins to understand where they are. Because yeah, I think learning from them is going to be really important. Yeah.
And the good news is, Peter Dahl, the reason he did that in part is that he's a Boy Scout leader, and his troop is based at Mayflower, so he still has an ongoing Mayflower connection, and he can probably help us with some of that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I saw another hand. Karen.
I just want to say we're very supportive of the heat pump idea. We installed one, as some of you know, at our family farm in the barn, and it not only supplies heat, but even better, air conditioning, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
But the question on heat, we have to have a supplemental heating system because on the really cold January days, it does not supply all the heat. Would that be part of this plan too?
Yeah, so I think without getting too far into the weeds, because there's a lot of unknowns, I think we understand that having just one system is probably not going to be the way to go. We might need to break apart how we treat different parts of the building, how we have that supplemental heat for when the heat pump isn't, if we were to use heat pumps for when they are not necessarily able to keep up with it as much. And so I think that's where something like the HVAC study is going to be really important, to really break apart the different parts of the building, understand what we need where. I think the other layer on that is knowing that, for example, I believe that the heating system for the chapel, don't quote me on this, but I want to say it's more in the range of 50 years old. Facilities management is recognizing that it's really a ticking clock. So understanding, and that's where when I mentioned becoming an initiative could be really helpful, because if we know that there's all these different layers in terms of what needs to happen when and how are we right-sizing things for our needs, it's got to be one of those parts and pieces. But yeah, I think to your point, we know that heat pumps are incredible. They do an incredible job, and I also, I believe, understand that the air conditioning that they provide is much more efficient than just your traditional air conditioning. So knowing that, and knowing that it can't necessarily meet all of the needs, so then what do we do? And I think, I don't remember all of the details of the Mount Olive tour, but that was something that they had to contend with as well. Even though their building is quite a bit smaller, they had kind of like ours, where there was like the building that was built in such and such decade, the building that was built in, the 70s. So they, different parts of the building were built at different times, and so they had to do some of that work as well, as I'm sure Mayflower has had to do.
As a periphery, non-active sort of member of this committee, I remember getting emails from you, David, about tabling, and it occurred to me tabling might be a good way to get membership into the Green Fund, and do it well, it's a little late to set it up for April, this month of whatever, what do we call this month? The Environment Month or
Earth
whatever.
Month, yeah.
But I mean, it could be an annual thing. Time to renew your thing, your Green Fund every year. So
Sustaining
just
member.
a thought.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I will put a plug in for, there is going to be some climate and environmental justice tabling. I believe it's May 12th. And so there will be some opportunity to have those conversations, which is awesome. So great suggestion.
I served on a committee with some of those Mayflower people, and wow. And I particularly Sarah Campbell, their minister, and I had a thought for Seth. One of the things that would be really cool, because we have astounding ministers too, is do a little, a switcheroo where Sarah would do a sermon for us. Her Earth Day sermon last year was the most astounding thing you'll ever hear. I mean, in that regime, she's just terrific. And of course, we have the best people. They would be happy to have that. I think it would be on this question of bringing the congregation along, which is not going to be that easy. This is not cheap, as we know. That kind of inspiring front end would be something to think about if that's possible, the way we work. The other thing is the Star Tribune did a supplement today. Their science section today is a really good one about just what we're talking about for your lives. It's really well done. So I recommend today's paper, The Strib.
Awesome.
I'd like to add something too about the costs of the project. We have a big opportunity right now. The Inflation Reduction Act. Plymouth, as it does geothermal, as it does solar, we have 40% of the costs paid by the federal government, assuming Congress doesn't change, so we get that going. But for instance, as we start replacing roofs, why don't we put more solar up there with 40% of it paid? I mean, it's a win. So,
When's the deadline on that?
well, it goes for 10 years unless they change the law.
Yeah, Mary.
I just wondered how much we had in the green fund now. Is that low?
Is it somewhere in the tune of 50,000? 50,000-ish is, I think, what's currently in the Green Fund. Seth has a more exact figure, but does that sound right?
I think, or maybe a little more, but that's about it.
Yeah.
When we table, we'll also have information on what happened to that money, because I really like that kind of, I think it's about that.
Yeah.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
I'm also a member of the committee. Just in terms of options, I mean, heat pumps are probably the way to go, I assume. But the geothermal, which is fantastic, is incredibly expensive, but incredibly important.
Right.
But then there are other heat pump options too. We can put more solar panels on, but that's only a small portion. We do need to replace those boilers at some point, as Tim was saying, they're beyond the normal lifespan now.
Yeah.
What are there other options other than heat pump that are significant? What might other options be for us?
Yeah, so I'm not going to be the expert on this, but there are a lot of options, is my understanding. And Tim knows more than I do.
Well, whether there's good options is still up for debate. There's new things called heat batteries. You could actually store heat in the ground yourself. And so these are possibilities for us as well. Well, like for instance, you have bricks. You can heat them up very, very high, and you can just tap off the heat as you need it.
And the good news is, we don't have to do this all at once. As Tim pointed out, we've got like all these different systems. We got boilers here, we got boilers there, we got rooftop units, and they're not all going to age out at the same time. And so the technology will evolve, and so we can knock off one part of the project, and the technology may improve, and then we get the. But it's really important to know. This is why we have to work with facilities. If we know that something's about to age out, let's prioritize that in terms of the next heat pump or whatever the technology is, and take that one first so that we're ready for it when it happens. And that's part of the thinking here.
Yeah.
This may be a question that's not possible to answer. We have 50,000 in the Green Fund. Is there any rough estimate of how much this is going to cost? And I guess it'd be over years, right? I mean,
Yeah, so over many years. There's a lot of estimates depending on which way you go. Where we're kind of starting right now is focused on just that building envelope study piece, and we know that's going to be the next thing we need to fund. And I believe the very rough estimate was between $10,000 and $20,000 for the building envelope study. But then when you get into actually replacing different units, if it's boilers or what have you, generally speaking, it's going to be a very large cost. And I think the question is, we know that there's going to be a cost of replacing it anyway, if it's going to be something that, either has broken or will age out of usage. So what's then the differential to get to the maybe next level of technology, or, again, it's that kind of, it's that kind of filter piece of how do you take all of the different needs that we have and balance those. And then I think also just knowing on Peter's slide, he really gets to how are we doing zero fossil fuels at Plymouth, or if we're doing really high efficiency, but we're still using some fossil fuels like natural gas, then are we using offsets as a congregation? And so it's not necessarily absolutes, and there's just a lot of balancing, I think, that we're going to need to do along the way.
Yeah. The main thing here, we really need a study. All we've done so far, all the studies have been, how can you save money? We haven't had a study on how can we reduce our carbon emissions. Now, at Mount Olive, they only used heat pumps to heat their sanctuary, and they're talking about expanding it to the rest of the building. We could do the same thing here, maybe we'd start with our sanctuary or something, so we could break it in small pieces. I have heard figures of $10 million to do the whole system here. But then you get 40% off from the federal government, and you don't have to pay for the heat anymore, but you have to pay for electricity, but you put solar on the roof, so that's where we're at. So.
And don't forget, we should be paying $75,000 a year for the CO2 we're pushing into the atmosphere. So we're getting a free ride now, so maybe it's time to pay up.
Anybody else?
I know we kind of need to close out soon, so I'll just put in a final, thank you all for being here. Thank you for your feedback, your questions. Let's continue to have conversations. Also, let folks know what you heard today, because I think, we can't necessarily talk to every single person in the congregation, but if everybody here talks to folks that are in their network, that's going to be really helpful. And of course, so Dave and I are the co-chairs of the Climate and Environmental Justice Committee. Get in touch with us if you want to get involved, or if you even just want to be on our listserv so that you kind of know some of the updates over time. And I think, thank you so much.
These guys are really great. Give them a hand. Well, we're going to stay on with the environmental focus next week. I think most of you perhaps have seen those 2 electric charging stations right outside the church on Nicollet. That's every hour, and that There's an exciting option of car sharing, of electric car sharing. And we're going to have a fellow come, one of the executives, James Vierling. He's going to be here telling us about that. Really a growing business here in the Twin Cities. It should be rather fascinating. The car sharing, it's short-term and long-term, and it's fascinating. So hope to see you next week too. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah. As you leave, if you didn't get one of the fresh energy brochures, Jim brought a number of them in. They talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and how you could save at home. So pick one up by the door there and check it out.
It has about 35 different things you can do on your own in your home. There's fantastic brochures, so pick one up as you leave.